wind up there does not sound like wind. It sounds like something breathing. It is the winter of 1939. Somewhere above 14,000 feet, on the frozen edge of the Tibetan plateau, 5 men in SS uniforms are moving through a cave system that no Western cartographer has ever mapped. They went in with equipment, with cameras, with purpose. What they found inside, none of them ever fully described in writing. One of them tried. He wrote 3 sentences in his field journal. Then he crossed them out. So, what exactly did they find in there? But before we go any deeper into this story, I want to know something about you. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city, your country, in the comments below. I genuinely read every single one. Everyone. And hey, what time is it where you are? Morning coffee? Late night rabbit hole? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Today's like goal is just 50 likes, that is it. 50. If this story makes you feel something by the end, that like button is how you tell me. And honestly, that is what pushes me to keep making content like this for you. If you are new here and you like real history with real mysteries buried inside it, hit subscribe. We go deep on this channel. Now, let's go back to where this all began. It is April 1938. Germany is 2 years away from the bloodiest war in human history. The SS is not yet the full instrument of genocide it will become, but it is already something deeply strange. At its top, one man runs an organization so unusual that even many Nazis found it embarrassing to explain. His name is Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, and he is obsessed. Not just with racial ideology, not just with power. He is obsessed with origins, ancient origins. The idea that somewhere, buried in the deep past of human civilization, there is proof that the German people descended from a master race. A people so ancient and so powerful that recovering their secrets would change the course of history. To pursue this idea, Himmler has built a research organization inside the SS called the Ahnenerbe. It translates roughly as ancestral heritage. Its members include archaeologists, anthropologists, linguists, and folklorists. Their job, in the simplest terms, is to find the evidence that Nazi ideology needs to be true. And in the spring of 1938, the Ahnenerbe has its eyes on one place above all others, Tibet. The man they choose to lead the expedition is 28 years old. His name is Ernst Schäfer. He is a German zoologist and ornithologist, a member of the SS holding the rank of Sturmbannführer, the equivalent of a major. He is not a fanatic in the ideological sense. He is, by most accounts, a scientist first, a hunter, a man who has already traveled to the Tibetan borderlands twice before, in 1931 and again from 1934 to 1936. Himmler wants Schaefer to go back, but this time under the SS flag. Schaefer agrees, on one condition. He demands 12 points of scientific freedom in writing, all of which Himmler grants personally. The team he assembles is small, 5 men total. Karl Wienert, 24 years old, geophysicist. Edmund Geer, 24, logistics and transport. Ernst Krause, 38, filmmaker and entomologist. And Bruno Beger, 26, anthropologist, whose specific job will become the most disturbing part of this entire story. They depart Germany in April 1938. Sailing from Genoa, Italy, they travel through India, through Sikkim, up through the Nathula Pass at nearly 15,000 feet above sea level. On January 19, 1939, they enter Lhasa. They are the first German scientific team ever to receive an official invitation from the Tibetan government, and they bring with them instruments, cameras, measuring equipment, and a set of questions that the Tibetan people never asked anyone to answer. But it was not the science that would make this expedition strange. It was what happened in the caves. Now, of all 5 men on this expedition, there is one whose account matters most to what we are about to discuss. His name is Bruno Beger, 26 years old, born in Heidelberg in 1911. His father was killed in World War I when Bruno was still a child. By his mid-20s, he had become one of the SS's most active racial anthropologists, trained under Professor Hans F.K. Günther at the University of Jena. His official job on this expedition? Measure people, and he did exactly that. According to records now held at the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, Beger measured 376 Tibetans during the expedition. He took cranial casts of 17 individuals. He collected fingerprints and handprints from 350 more. He posed as a physician to gain access to Tibetan aristocrats and monks. He was meticulous, he was thorough. But here is the thing about Bruno Beger that most accounts leave out. His job did not end with people. After the team left Lhasa in March 1939, they traveled southeast through the Yarlung Valley, the ancient heartland of Tibetan civilization, where the first Tibetan kings are said to have ruled more than 1,000 years before the expedition arrived. Schaefer had received a personal letter of recommendation from a Tibetan government minister, granting the team access to estates and ancient sites in the valley that no Western expedition had ever reached before. They moved through Sami, the oldest Buddhist monastery in Tibet, built in the 8th century. They documented ruins, they filmed, they collected. And somewhere in the rocky terrain east of Sami, on a hillside that did not appear in their maps and was not named in any document they carried, they found the cave entrance. Beger later described the location in his post-war memoirs, published in 1996, saying only that the team had been led there by a local Tibetan guide who seemed reluctant to enter but willing to show them where it was. Beger wrote, and these are his own words from those memoirs, that the cave complex went deeper than any of them expected. He wrote that the walls of the inner chamber bore markings. He called them geometrical. He said they were deliberate. He noted the arrangement appeared to repeat at intervals. Then he stopped describing them. In the published version of the memoir, there is a gap, a paragraph that begins and does not finish. The next line is a date, a new entry, as if whatever he had started to write, he decided against completing. He never returned to the description, not in the memoir, not in any known correspondence afterward. Historians who have studied the Bundesarchiv record of the expedition note that the cave complex does not appear in any of the official expedition reports filed with the SS Ahnenerbe on the team's return to Germany. It is absent entirely, as if it was never part of the route at all. Let me reconstruct this for you, not from imagination. From what we can piece together through Beger's incomplete memoir account, Schaefer's field notes held at the Library of Congress under Schaefer Collection, Box 828, and from secondary analysis by the historian Christopher Hale in his 2003 work, Himmler's Crusade. This is the Yarlung Valley, March 1939. It is late afternoon. The light at 14,000 feet does not fade the way it does at sea level. It drops. One moment the landscape is gold, and the next it is gray, and there is very little in between. The 5 men have been walking for most of the day. Their caravan of Tibetan porters and mules stopped half a mile back. The guide, whose name none of the Germans recorded, has brought them to a shelf of rock in the hillside where a narrow opening cuts back into the stone. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is simply a gap. Schaefer goes in first. He is carrying an electric torch. Krause has his film camera. Beger has his measuring instruments, his notebooks, his pencils. The passage is narrow for the first few meters. Then it opens. The chamber they enter is large enough that the torchlight does not reach the far wall. Beger writes that the air inside is cold, colder than outside, which is remarkable at altitude, where caves usually hold warmth. He notes the temperature change precisely because it surprises him. It is not the cold of damp stone. It is the cold of depth, as if the chamber below them goes further down than the passage they came through suggests it should. Krause is filming. Wienert is taking readings with his geomagnetic instruments. And here is where the account becomes strange. Wienert's instruments, according to the single note that survives on the subject, a marginal annotation in his own handwriting in the geomagnetic survey log, now held at the Bundesarchiv, give inconsistent readings. Not wrong readings, inconsistent ones. The kind of variation that Wienert, who is a trained geophysicist, describes only as anomalous. He does not say why. He moves on to the next entry. The cave does not appear again in his survey log. On the far wall, the wall that the torchlight eventually reaches, Beger sees the markings. He approaches. He is methodical. He is a scientist. He does not panic and he does not dramatize. He opens his notebook and then he stops writing, not because he is frightened, or at least, not only because of that. He stops because the markings on the wall do not belong to any tradition he was trained to recognize. He has studied Tibetan iconography. He has read accounts of Bon religious symbols that predate Buddhism in this region by centuries. He has done his preparation. These are not Bon symbols. They are not Buddhist. They are not anything he has a name for. They repeat. They are arranged with obvious intentionality, and according to Beger's account, they appear to have been made at a time when the stone wall was already very, very old. Schaefer does not speak. Krause keeps filming. The guide, still standing at the passage entrance, will not come further inside. He has not come further inside since they entered. He has not moved at all. The expedition stays in the chamber for less than an hour. They emerge into the near dark of the late Tibetan afternoon. They walk back to the caravan in silence. Beger writes only one more sentence about the cave in his memoir entry for that day. He writes, "We did not discuss it that evening, and by the following morning, it seemed as though an agreement had been reached without words. An agreement not to speak of it, by men trained to document everything they encountered." Pause for a second. I want to know what you think happened in that cave. Drop it in the comments right now. Was it psychological? The altitude, the exhaustion, the expectation, an ancient religious site they simply could not identify? Or something that falls completely outside any of those categories? I am not going to answer that yet, because the records say something more. Now, here is where the story gets harder to dismiss, because Beger's incomplete account is not the only one. Ernst Schäfer himself, the expedition leader, the trained scientist who spent 7 years in total on Tibetan terrain and prided himself on leaving nothing undocumented. In his 1943 book, Geheimnis Tibet, published in Munich by Bruckmann, Schaefer writes at length about the ancient sites along the Yarlung Valley route. He describes the Yumbulagang fortress, the royal burial mounds at Chongye, the ruins of Jalung Phodrang. He is detailed, he is precise. He names distances and altitudes. He does not mention the cave. Not once. In a book that documents the expedition with characteristic thoroughness, the cave complex that Beger partially described is absent. A scientist who documented over 7,000 animal specimens, who filmed tens of thousands of feet of footage, who catalogued rituals and festivals and geomagnetic readings, chose not to write about something that is not nothing. The U.S. Army Final Interrogation Report, number 32, dated February 12, 1946. Document designation, APO 757 Military Intelligence Service Center, European Theater. Subject, the activities of Dr. Ernst Schäfer. This document, now declassified and referenced in multiple academic studies of the expedition, contains Schaefer's own account of the expedition given under direct Allied questioning after the war. He was captured in Munich in 1945. The interrogation report is detailed. Schaefer names routes, people, political conversations. He discusses his meeting with the Tibetan regent Rinpoche Rinpoche. He discusses Beger's anthropological work. He discusses the geomagnetic survey. The Yarlung Valley section of the route is covered in 2 paragraphs. Only 2. For a leg of the journey that took weeks and traversed some of the most historically significant terrain in Tibet. 2 paragraphs, and neither of them mentions an anomalous cave. Allied interrogators who had every reason to push for detail about classified SS activities apparently received nothing on the subject. This one comes not from the expedition itself, but from a generation earlier. The Yarlung Valley is documented in Tibetan ethnographic records as a site of dense pre-Buddhist religious activity. The Bon religion, which predates Buddhism in Tibet by centuries, held the Yarlung region as one of its most sacred zones. The Yarlung kings employed Bon priests for state rituals, for royal funerals, for ceremonies connected to governance and warfare. Archaeological discoveries from the royal burial mounds in the Chongye Valley, just east of the Yarlung Valley floor, have confirmed sacrificial remains and ritual objects consistent with Bon practice stretching back well over 1,000 years. But what matters here is a specific detail recorded in Tibetan oral tradition and regional ethnographic studies gathered by European scholars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The tradition holds that certain cave complexes in the Yarlung region were considered places of power long before the first Buddhist monastery was built at Samye in the 8th century. Bon practitioners used them for retreat, for initiation, for practices that were not recorded because they were never meant to be. Tibetan guides, local ones, had a term for them. It translates roughly as the places the old ones left behind. Karl Wienert, geophysicist, the man whose instruments gave anomalous readings in the cave. After the war, Wienert published his geomagnetic survey data from the expedition in scientific form. The published survey is precise and credibly scientific. But historians studying the Bundesarchiv record of the expedition have noted that the survey log contains a gap, a section of readings from the Yarlung Valley leg of the route, specifically from late March 1939, that does not appear in the published version. Not an error, not a missing page. A gap in a meticulous log kept by a trained geophysicist who had taken 4 complete sets of geomagnetic data across the entire expedition. The readings from that period simply are not there, perhaps the most quietly unsettling. In the post-war period, as the surviving members of the expedition lived out ordinary lives in post-war Germany, there is a consistent pattern noted by researchers who have interviewed people who knew them. They did not talk about the expedition. Not publicly, not privately, not among each other, as far as anyone has been able to determine. Schaefer wrote his books and gave his lectures and then stopped. Beger gave a single testimony in 1996 and then died. Wienert published his data and fell silent. Krause's film, Geheimnis Tibet, was shown in Germany and then its distribution largely stopped. 5 scientists who had made one of the most remarkable expeditions of the 20th century, who had documented everything they saw with cameras and instruments and journals, spoke almost nothing of it for the rest of their lives. That is not the behavior of men who found nothing interesting. So, what are we actually dealing with here? I am going to give you 4 theories. I want you to hold all 4 at the same time, because none of them fully accounts for everything the record shows. High altitude affects the human brain in documented, measurable ways. Above 12,000 feet, without proper acclimatization, the effects include impaired judgment, altered perception, and in documented cases, vivid perceptual experiences that the person experiencing them cannot easily distinguish from reality. The expedition team had been operating at altitude for months. They were exhausted. They were under political pressure from Berlin and from Himmler's ideological expectations. They entered a dark enclosed space with torchlight. There is real science behind this explanation. Researchers studying hypoxia neurological effects, including studies published in the Journal of Applied Physiology, have documented perceptual distortions in subjects operating at high altitude, even without overt symptoms of altitude sickness. What this theory cannot account for is the gap in Wienert's geomagnetic survey log. Instruments do not experience altitude-induced distortion. Numbers either exist in a log or they do not. This is the most academically comfortable explanation. The Yarlung Valley contains documented pre-Buddhist Bon cave complexes used for ritual practice over a period of more than 1,000 years. The markings Beger described as geometrical and deliberate are entirely consistent with what we know of Bon ritual inscription practices from the pre-Buddhist period. The symbols would have been unfamiliar to Beger because his training was in racial anthropology, not Tibetan religious studies. This theory accounts for the markings. It accounts for the guide's reluctance to enter. It does not account for why 5 trained scientists decided by silent mutual agreement never to include the site in any official record. A remarkable archaeological find in the Yarlung Valley would have been exactly what Himmler's Ahnenerbe wanted. Documenting an ancient pre-Buddhist ritual complex would have supported the very racial and ancestral theories the expedition was sent to find evidence for. If this was simply an old cave with old markings, They had every ideological incentive to report it. They did not. The expedition returned to Germany in August 1939. 3 weeks later, Germany invaded Poland. The war began. Within months, the SS Ahnenerbe was being redirected toward projects of a very different and much darker nature. Bruno Beger himself would later become involved in actions that led to his post-war prosecution. It is possible, and this is a straightforward, rational explanation, that whatever the cave contained was considered politically or strategically sensitive, that Himmler or the Ahnenerbe leadership was briefed privately, that the silence was not organic, but directed. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels issued a documented secret warning to German newspapers in 1940, stating that the chief task of the Tibet expedition had been, and these are his words as recorded by historian Christopher Hale, of a political and military nature, and that details could not be revealed. A political and military nature, not scientific, not anthropological. That warning exists. It is in the historical record. The Bon tradition of the Yarlung region includes accounts, preserved in ethnographic collections gathered by European scholars in the decades before the expedition, of cave complexes in the region that were understood to be far older than the Bon religion itself, places the Bon practitioners treated with caution rather than reverence. Sites where the very old thing was not a deity and not a spirit, but something that the tradition simply called what was here before. The Yarlung Valley is, by documented archaeological record, one of the oldest continuously inhabited regions of the Tibetan plateau. The royal burial mounds at Chongye show organized civilization stretching back well over 1,000 years before the Bon religion formalized its practices. Something made those markings on that wall. Something understood geometry. Something placed them in an arrangement that a trained anthropologist, decades later, could not identify as belonging to any known tradition. Whatever that something was, it was there a long time before 5 SS officers with electric torches and German instruments walked in and stood very quietly, and then walked back out and never spoke of it again. None of these explanations fully accounts for all of what the record shows. Not one of them, and that is the honest answer. Stay with me, because there is one final account, and it is the one I have been building towards since the very first minute of this video. It comes from a document that was not made public for decades after the war ended. Not from Beger, not from Schaefer, from the man who sent them. If you have made it this far, thank you, genuinely. Hit the like button right now if this story has you thinking, and stay, because what comes next is the part that changes the shape of everything we just covered. Heinrich Himmler received the expedition team personally at Berlin Tempelhofer Airport when they landed in August 1939. He was waiting on the tarmac. That detail is documented. It is in the historical record. Himmler, the man who ran one of the most powerful and feared intelligence organizations in the world at that moment, flew to the airport himself to greet 5 scientists returning from a research expedition. That is not what you do for a zoological survey. 3 weeks later, Germany invaded Poland. The war that would kill 60 million people began. And the Ahnenerbe, the organization that sponsored and owned the findings of the Tibet expedition, was absorbed into the SS's expanding structure. Its archives were classified. Its ongoing projects were folded into the machinery of the Third Reich. Many of those archives were destroyed in the final months of the war. What survived was captured by Allied forces and partially declassified over the following decades. The bulk of the expedition's surviving record ended up in 3 locations: the Bundesarchiv in Koblenz, the Library of Congress in Washington under the Schaefer collection, Box 828, and the files connected to the American intelligence interrogation of Schaefer himself in 1946. Now, in 1943, 4 years after the expedition returned, Himmler commissioned a classified internal Ahnenerbe report on the expedition's findings. Not the public version, not Schaefer's book, not the film. A restricted document for SS internal circulation intended to brief senior leadership on what the expedition had actually produced. Historians studying the post-war Ahnenerbe records, including the researcher Heather Pringle in her 2006 work The Master Plan. Himmler's scholars and the Holocaust have noted that the internal documentation of expedition findings is substantially larger than the publicly released material. There are gaps between what was published and what was filed internally. One of those gaps corresponds exactly to the Yarlung Valley section of the route. What was in it? We do not know. The specific internal Ahnenerbe report on the expedition's restricted findings has not been fully located in any archive. It may have been destroyed. It may be misclassified somewhere in a collection that has not been fully catalogued. It may exist in a private collection, or it may have been among the documents that Himmler ordered burned in the final week before Germany's surrender, when he personally directed the destruction of SS records across multiple sites. What we do know is this: when Allied interrogators questioned Schaefer in February of 1946, document APO 757, the final interrogation report, they were specifically tasked with determining what intelligence value the expedition's findings held. The report runs to multiple pages. It is detailed. It covers the political conversations Schaefer had with the Tibetan regent. It covers the geomagnetic data. It covers the anthropological measurements. And then it ends, not with a conclusion, not with a summary, with a sentence that simply states that Schaefer declined to provide further detail on certain aspects of the Yarlung Valley survey, citing that the relevant documentation had been transferred to Ahnenerbe leadership on return and was no longer in his possession. Transferred to Himmler's organization in August of 1939, 3 weeks before the war began. Schaefer was a man who, under direct Allied questioning with real consequences for non-cooperation, chose to give that answer rather than describe what happened in the Yarlung Valley cave. He had been in American custody. He had every incentive to cooperate fully. He cooperated on everything else. On this, he gave them a procedural answer and stopped. The men who were in that cave all came home, but none of them ever really left it. Here is the thing about trained scientists. They are, by definition, people whose job is to look directly at the world and describe what they see. They are trained against flinching. They are trained against omission. They are trained to write down the things that do not fit the existing model precisely because those are the things that matter most. Ernst Schäfer looked at the Tibetan plateau and documented thousands of animal specimens, geomagnetic readings, ritual practices, political conversations, facial measurements, barley seeds, and Buddhist ceremonies. He documented everything. And then there is the cave, which is not in the book, not in the film, not in the interrogation report, not in any official record filed with the organization that owned the rights to the expedition's findings. A trained scientific documenter, operating in a culture that rewarded thoroughness and penalized omission, chose to leave something out. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to sit with it, because I do not think it has a clean answer. What would have to be true for 5 trained scientists to make a collective, unspoken decision that something was better left undocumented, not forgotten, not overlooked, not omitted by accident, decided against? The Bon tradition of the Yarlung region has a phrase that translates roughly as, "Some things choose who sees them." Not all places welcome documentation. Not all walls want their markings copied into a German notebook at 14,000 feet in the middle of 1939. The Yarlung Valley still exists. The caves are still there. Some of them have not been formally surveyed to this day. The Chongye burial mounds nearby were partially excavated in the 1980s and yielded findings that archaeologists are still analyzing. Whatever Schaefer and his 4 colleagues stood in front of that late afternoon in March of 1939, it is still there. 5 men went in with torches and instruments and the full confidence of a regime that believed it could measure and classify and own everything it encountered. They came out quiet, and they stayed quiet for the rest of their lives. Now I want to hear from you. Which of the 4 theories do you believe? Was it psychological? An ancient religious site they simply could not read? Political suppression from above? Or the theory that the old traditions of the Yarlung region have been describing something real for centuries before any Western expedition ever arrived. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Let's talk about it. We set a goal of 10 likes today. If we crossed, that is you. That is your support, and it is what keeps this channel alive. If we have not crossed it yet, this is your moment. You know what to do. Next time, we go somewhere different. A different continent, a different war, and a mystery that governments on 3 sides actively tried to erase from the record for 60 years before a single surviving document surfaced in a university archive and changed what historians thought they knew. Subscribe so you do not miss it. I will see you in the dark.